I'm Todd, and I was naughty. I did everything wrong. I got kicked out of art school, I drank heavily, and I looked to other religions and versions of spirituality to get fulfilled. The problem was, I was in the occult and I didn't even know it. My life was a wreck, and I had to learn what it meant to have a relationship with Jesus.
And I'm Laura. I was super nice. I did everything right. I got saved young, went to Moody Bible Institute, got married, and followed the Christian rules to having a good life. The problem was that formula didn't work. I had to change how I related with Jesus.
At the end of the day, what I learned is the very simple truth. Jesus is the answer, and the only one that will ever actually fulfill you.
Naughty
versus
nice.
Welcome back to Naughty versus Nice. Of course, I'm Todd.
And I'm Laura.
And I'm Kelly.
There we
Nice
go.
jumping.
All right. We are, and we're in. And this week, we are talking about communion. The idea of communion itself, and kind of everybody takes a little sippy cup of grape juice, has a little bit of bread, sometimes gluten-free, depending on where you're at on that. And some churches do it every single week. Some do it only once or twice a year. It just kind of depends. But this week, we're just going to kind of talk about it, hash out some of the concepts of it and what it's really about. And then not only that, and just ask the very simple question, are we even doing it correctly in the way that we're engaging in it today versus how the early in the first church actually did it, let alone how Jesus actually kind of laid everything out for his disciples when they had that very famous Last Supper.
And I kind of was curious with your guys' varied experiences. We all come from different backgrounds. How has communion been done for you? Not so much the procedure of, is it bread or is it wafer, but ritual. The pre-sermon is what I call it. There's usually an admonition to something. What is your guys' background with that?
I don't know. I feel like, Kelly, you might have more experience with this than me. I mean, overall.
Well, we were Catholic when I was super young. And so that was a whole different ball game of everybody drinking out of the same cup. But of course, I didn't participate because I was young. So it was the parents and stuff going up. And then then we were Southern Baptist for a long time. And that really looked the same in every church I visited where, the deacons would come hand out the wafers and hand out the juice. And the message would always be the same, the Jesus speaking, this is the bread and this, remember me and stuff like that. I sound really informative on this. So, but it was, just this is what it is. And then it changed when we went to the non-denominational church 10 years ago. That was different. And they would break up in small groups to do the juice part. And first I was like, this is weird. But then I was like, oh, I kind of like it because there was a small group of you. You could go with your family and pray together or close friends or, a different group each week, each month when you did it and stuff. So but essentially they all looked the same. You were individually standing there while somebody hand you a wafer and hand you a little cup of juice. And then you make sure your heart is clear with Jesus before you take it.
It's kind of got the atmosphere of like a library. You're in the reference section, but there's this guy subtly picking a guitar, usually on stage, or some sort of subtle music or something going on. A time for remembrance, at least that's the way I've always kind of interacted with it. If Jesus is saying something specific, do this in remembrance of me, then that's what I'm going to focus on. I'm not trying to figure out what I could have done different in order to make the next level of, Donkey Kong or whatever video game is popular with the kids these days. So I know I'm showing my age, right? I know it's Call of Duty 6 or whatever. That was a joke. So,
you're showing your age now because there's a picture of you.
Right. Yeah. Just the gray hair. It's either I got a really severe copper deficiency or I'm definitely more boomer material than I wish I was. So, but it's always done, it's more ritualistic in the way that it's presented. It's done the exact same way every single time, whether you're in, like, depending on your church. So when Kelly and I were doing it for all of us, actually, it was always very ritualistic in the way that it was done, the way it was presented, and the way that so much so that if something was going to be different, somebody would comment about the fact that something was going to be different ahead of time in order to prepare everybody for it. So that way they're not like, this is different this time, And it's funny, we're even talking about this at a certain point because Kelly and I have been discussing the topic of it in general and just asking that question. Have we not like wrong, not like, are we doing it wrong, and it affects salvation or something? That's a whole nother podcast 2 episodes ago or a few episodes ago, but more like, what was the original intent, and how would the men that were doing it the first time, how would they have understood what's going on? And then try to start there and then build out from there. And then ask the question is, what we're doing in church today, is it representative of that?
Okay. Well, my experience has been varied in different settings. When I lived in Chicago, we went to a church there, and I loved how they did communion. There was some sobriety, but mostly celebration. There was rejoicing. There's this big excitement afterwards. I know it was the blood. The pastor always went over the keyboard and played that. And it was very refreshing. I grew up Lutheran, so it was very, I'm going to say, dry. But then the common theme I see is it's rote. We do the same thing over and over. It's the same two passages are read. There's no acknowledgement of the history of it, what it means at all beyond remembering something he did. And the worst one is that we ought to have the somber music playing, and you need to evaluate if you have any sin that you need to confess first, which all of a sudden layers it with, this is a works receivable table. Like if you haven't earned it, you can't go forward. And then, or the famous one is, well, if you have a problem, if you have any conflict with anybody in your life, then you need to go straighten that out before you come and take of the table in an unworthy manner. Well, those are all things that are rather out of context. That's maybe for a little later in the discussion. But I think it's important to understand that we don't have Old Testament feasts and practices, and then we get to Jesus and we shut the book, and now he started something brand new, and now we have communion, and it has no connection to Passover whatsoever. And so people don't know, they don't even know the history of the celebration that was taking place within the event of the crucifixion. And so there's a lot of themes getting missed. So I had kind of gone through, I wanted to come up with like a 2-minute Bible review. You go back in time and you have Abraham, and he's promised that there will be a seed and he will have a nation. And then you fast forward and you have Isaac, and then you have Jacob, and Jacob has his 12 sons, which become the 12, tribes. And in his sons is his favorite Joseph. Joseph is, a brat. And so his brothers kidnap him and sell him and throw him in the well. And he has all these afflictions, and then he rises up and he's Pharaoh's right-hand man. And then his brothers are in a famine in Canaan. And he, through a long, huge story, basically brings his whole family over. God promises Jacob that it's okay to go into Egypt. They go in and they stay there. And Joseph dies and is buried there, right? Then the pharaohs forget. The new pharaoh comes and he doesn't remember any relationship that Joseph had with this pharaoh. And now they become threatened by their numbers and their presence. And so they start to make them slaves. And then they're mistreated for 400 years, which is what God told Abraham in the beginning. Your descendants will be held in captivity for 400 years. Then we have Moses come on the scene. He's got his own story, not necessarily relevant to the big picture right now. We all know the story. Moses goes in to an exiled people who have been crying out, but not to God. They've just been crying out and suffering. God hears them, sends a man in to deliver them, a man from their own national heritage. And he asks Pharaoh to let them go. Pharaoh won't let them go. And so then you have the 9 plagues, which are directed at the Egyptians. So you'll have kind of a picture as it's painting out that the Israelites are kind of over the side, and you've got the Egyptians over here suffering the plagues, but they don't feel it. And they're not, that I can recall, asked to do anything in order to be protected from those plagues. But then the 10th one comes, and then comes the command that this is going to happen. And if you want to be spared from it, you have to basically sacrifice this lamb, which would involve, slitting it open, draining the blood, painting the doorposts with this blood. And then you would eat of the lamb. You're going to fire roast it, I think, and nothing can remain of it for the next day. That is kind of what the ceremony will go on to be. And they are making bread, but they have to leave that night because so fast that the bread doesn't have time to rise. And so that's where the feast will start to be celebrated in the future with unleavened bread. So you've got this whole picture going on of why they had to do what they had to do. But there's so many interesting facets. They did not have the option to just rest in their heritage, and this would pass over them. There was an obligation to respond to a command in faith and cooperate with what they were being asked to do in belief that this practice would protect them. Now, culturally, would they have understood sacrifices to somehow appeal to the protection of the gods? I think so. So I don't think it's as random as it would be to us. But as you know, I had a Bible teacher once say, imagine you're in these dwelling places. I don't know if it were huts or houses or what. And you can hear the grief and the sorrow as this angel of death ravages this land. And the firstborn of the animals, the firstborn of the households from poor to rich, they're dying, firstborn males left and right. And there's probably screaming and mourning and grief. And they're huddled in these homes with faith that this painted blood over the doorposts or over the doorways is going to protect them. There's a whole lot of stuff going on in that alone. Then you add on the ideas that they were obviously in captivity and in exile. And God says, in order to celebrate this as a feast in the future, they are to remember that they had the unleavened bread because they left in haste. There was very much that there was this massive plague and they had to hit the road the very next moment they're on their way out. There's all of those things are going on. You see that God has called his people back to himself, not just to rescue them from slavery, but to draw them to worship him at Mount Sinai and then eventually in Canaan. He's drawing them out for a relationship. So this is a huge event in the Israeli nation. This is the one event that God will say, you have to celebrate this. And the reason you will celebrate this is so you will tell your children of the night that you left under these circumstances and in this kind of haste. So there's all this history there. I don't know. Is anything kind of connecting so far in your minds about how this might connect to where Christ is going? That's a legitimate question. It was rhetorical.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, immediately you have the symbolism of the lamb. It's really, really hard to miss. And not only that, but the fact that the lamb itself then is also part of that Passover meal. And the instant you get to the Last Supper, I don't think I ever realized it before until doing research for this episode, that they all just sat down and ate a Passover lamb. And Christ is the lamb. So when Christ is saying, this is my flesh, all of a sudden there's a little bit more of a three-dimensionality to it. Yes, regarding the bread, but he's the bread of life as well, but he's also the lamb. So it's not just he's all of those things happening all together, all at the exact same time, all being presented in this one thing that is the freedom from sin, from the Pharaoh Satan figure, in being, and not only that, but Satan's at the meal himself. So you've got all these things colliding all together, and I don't think that gets communicated at all when you all just stand there in silence and everybody drinks, from their little thimble and everybody takes the cracker. I'm not belittling it. Don't get me wrong. I take it very seriously, and I try to do that in remembrance and be grateful and be appreciative and stop and clear my head of everything and be in the moment and really think about that. But there's a ritual to it, and it's not relationship-y, and it's just, I'm just really starting to look at things differently the more and more I learn and the more connections I'm making.
And to know that Christ is crucified during this event, but to also know part of preparing for the Passover was to go through rituals that they went through. One, it's a full meal. And so you've got these symbolic pieces of the meal that mean something to the event that happened. But you also would be reading through the Exodus event. And you're also going to be reading, I think it's Psalm 113 through 118. So you have Christ on the night that he is going to be betrayed and turned over to be executed, have him reviewing the scriptures that would foretell of him who would come and do this in a final manner. So he is being encouraged by the very history and the shadow and the promise of those events and that ceremony as he partakes to prepare to go forth and follow the Lord in obedience and to complete the work. So now you've got that layer. He isn't making something new. Everyone's like, well, now it's communion. It's not Passover. I guess if you want to call it that, but it's more that idea of, Kit uses the term reconstituting. So he's taking something of Israel that It never worked. It failed. And he's fulfilling it and bringing it to perfection. And then he's going to say to them in kind of a retro look back to when he fed the 5,000 and he said, I'm the bread of life. And when he says at the raising of Lazarus, I'm the resurrection, I am the life. There is an idea that is super offensive. But he is saying, if you want to live, you need me for life so much that it's almost cannibalistic. You have to eat my flesh. You have to drink my blood. You have to be absorbed into the life I bring. And you can't do it in any means of your own. And so it would have been connecting because they ate the sacrificial lamb. They participated. It was communal. It was relational. It was ceremonial. It was obedience. It was faith. It was remembrance. He's calling us in this event to embrace the fulfillment of the events out of Exodus, that exile and that rescue, and how those things were foreshadowing. And then to recognize on this larger scale what Christ has done. And then in addition to say, to do this in remembrance of me, everyone's like, well, now we remember what Jesus did for us and we're thankful. But he makes it bigger when he says, but I won't do this again until you sit down with me again. And I always got confused with that when I was younger. Like, well, so like every time someone goes to be with him, are we having that meal over, not understanding that he's saying, when I come back the final time to rescue you from this exile that still exists, because we are aliens and strangers, just as the Israelites were, we are aliens and strangers in a land that does not fit to who we are now. He says, when I come back to bring the new heavens, the new earth, and I resurrect your physical body, we will sit down together again and we will eat this. That's not being told at church. I think that brings you to the table with a full picture of what you're remembering, the whole picture of the Passover and the fulfillment of Christ. But also there's another promise there. There's another promise that a deliverer is coming and our exile will end.
I have written down, it's not about a new ritual. Jesus is unveiling the fulfillment of centuries of prophecy, all that point to the cross, which is about the creation of an entirely new people. Under a new covenant, it's not just about individual salvation. And I think it's interesting because the more and more we explore a lot of these topics and talk about them, we keep seeing these recurring themes kind of pop up over and over again that have always been there, but have been kind of swept under the rug, so to speak. Not like the church is embarrassed about them or not like they're unwilling to talk about them, but just the way that the modern church has kind of shown up in the world today, it seems to hit the points of more the individual salvation, like we've talked about, and more of these feel-good messaging. And don't get me wrong, there's a proper place for that. If somebody's in a really dark place, somebody's suffering from terrible depression or terrible sense of no self-worth, I am not saying the church needs to stop letting people know that Jesus loves them and that their life matters and it has value. Not by any stretch, but it's also not the only thing. And there's a number of things that when you come to recognize about what's going on, like I said, for me, there was this immediate aha moment when I realized that the meal itself was lamb. I was like, are you kidding me? Like, of course it is. Of course it's perfectly fulfilled. Of course it's this complete thing that it's too perfect to be made up at a certain point.
And before we came to record tonight, one of my sons said, well, what are you talking about? And I said, communion. And he said, well, I hope you address the fact that it seems weird that we do it because we don't actually believe that's his body. And if you don't believe that, you don't believe it's his blood, then you shouldn't be doing it. And I was like, I don't even know where that view came from. But I was like, because there's been no connection made between the whole thread of redemptive history as to what this event, the fact that his death and his crucifixion would happen on this night, on this day, during this event, and then the resurrection would take place in the Feast of Unleavened Bread. All of that means something. And then for him to give the command that it has value in the community of the body, that we aren't to do this the way we're doing it, isolated alone in our little chairs with our little dry cracker and our little glass of wine and hoping nobody actually comes and talks to us, because that's actually what I feel most of the time, just to be honest. It was then, after Christ in the first church, celebrated as a meal, as fellowship, where these themes, this hope, this fulfillment, this promise was encouraged to one another. And this is how we persevere as saints, is because we look and we remember everything that was encapsulated in that night and how it sums up what he came to do.
And it's kind of like what we've talked about before, at least especially within Roman culture at the time, let alone even, portions of Jewish culture itself, that were getting Romanized over time. The kind of like a caste system, meaning that there's just levels to it. And certain people are of higher status, and their behavior, the accoutrement, the way that they present themselves, the things that they have with them, they all reflect that status, whether it's the title or position that they have, down to the clothing that they wear. And Christianity comes along and blows all that out of the water. It's not saying don't go out and live in the world and continue as you have in your statuses and levels. But what it is saying is, when we get together and we have this meal in remembrance of Christ in the kingdom as brothers and sisters in Jesus, then all that's off the table. Or it's all on the table, I guess, depending if you're using the analogy, is that the instant you start breaking bread, it doesn't matter if you're a tax collector, it doesn't matter if you're an emperor, and it doesn't matter if you're a slave, it doesn't matter what position you have. You're all brothers and sisters in Christ. And that's a lot of what, Paul kind of addresses with the Corinthians, is that they were just having a hard time with this. They were slipping back into a lot of their old patterns and old behaviors. And we're only talking, a decade after Christ dies, basically. It happened that quickly. So here we are, almost 2,000 years later, and we've reverted everything down into this rote, ritual, solemn, mundane kind of, mundane's not really right, but like this event where it's not this joyous, ruckus, laughter, and celebration of being alive in Christ and being part of this new creation and the new kingdom and citizens of that. It's this more solemn moment of like interpersonal reflection. And I'm not saying it doesn't have its place. I'm just saying I don't think that they're necessarily like this, when it comes to it. They don't gel up.
And that kind of what I was always hearing is, examine yourself, that you're not taking it in an unworthy manner, meaning that you aren't harboring something secret or sinful or even a problem with your friend or whatever. And that idea, like what you were saying, is that Paul was calling them to recognize that they were grieving the sacrament itself, or the event, the celebration, by seeking to put labels and categorize people. And they gave more value to some and less value to others. And the gospel, the main thrust of a changed life, is the way that believers interact in a body in which everyone shares equal value and respect and love. And they were disrespecting the whole principle of this new humanity by putting basically levels and, someone is better here than someone else. And that was examine how you're taking it, because you as a community are not taking it well together. It was a little less this individual, hey, are you fully aware of everything you've done? It's a far more communal idea than it's given credit for. I've never been in a church where it's a feast or it's a meal or there's any more reading of scripture than other those Corinthian, on the night in which he was betrayed, the Lord Jesus took the bread, nobody ever. I keep every Sunday, I'd be like, is anyone going to go somewhere else? Because it's kind of boring. And that sounds really bad to say that out loud. So maybe we can erase that.
Acts 2:42 through 47 says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All of the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had a need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. They praised God and enjoyed the favor of all the people, and the Lord added to their number daily who were being saved. So we get this completely different depiction of what's going on. And this breaking of the bread, it's a mention alongside teaching and fellowship and prayer. It's kind of like everything we do in church in a weird sort of way, all rolled into one, but around a table, everybody asking, can you pass the salt? And, gobbling whatever and just having a good time with it and cracking jokes and doing all that kind of stuff that, everything that goes on at the dinner table. There's this organic part of life where the sharing of that meal, it becomes the sharing of lives. There's an intimacy that goes on with that. You don't eat dinners with your enemies, generally speaking. You do it with people that you have deep relationship with, or fellowship with, or friendship with, or family, to stretch that metaphor. So when we engage in it and we all face in one direction and we all have our head down, and yes, we're in prayer, and these things matter and they're important, but it's still, there's a part of it, and I keep going back to it, there's a wider picture. And I think that there is this celebratory gratitude, the fellowship of the meal, there's that kind of thing. It's just not seen in how we do it these days. And I don't know, I don't think a church is going to be like, let's break out the big tables, guys, and everybody have pasta, or whatever. But it gets to the point where it's like, Kelly and I were even talking about this maybe a month or two ago. It's like, maybe we need to start having dinners, just inviting other people over, believers, whether we know them really well or not, and just have like one meal a month where we can just sit around and tell knock jokes and just have a good time and just, be in celebration of Christ together, that kind of thing.
I would put a small boundary on the idea, because I've thought a lot about it. Like, what would I tell people to do differently? There was obviously some structure to it in being intentional about what was celebrated, what was discussed, but I don't want that to become just another ritual. I think that the community event of it being the togetherness, the real fellowship, the real gathering, the real community, but also making sure there's somebody kind of, steering it so that it's always, because there's a lot of big themes that, once their deliverance was made clear, the angel of death passes through and they know they're delivered, they are immediately transferred from one citizenship to another. That's the reason there's haste that night. The deliverance from the sin, so the blood really almost represents more the sin, the deliverance from the sin itself. But then they are transported to another land, another nationality, another worship system, another culture. And it brought to mind to me in Colossians when it says, you have been transferred from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light. There's something that you've been moved from one to another. And there's a permanency that we see in that with Egypt, needs to be assigned to the spiritual reality of what has happened in being saved. So those concepts, I mean, can you imagine the multitude of conversations, at least that we all could have? I mean, over meals discussing just the symbolism, like, what is it? Why would he call his people to remember this event and this meal and these symbols? And then say, well, why is Christ then attaching himself to that very same tradition and saying to remember? What are we remembering of Christ? Because it seems like unlikely means the blood of an offering is covering everything I am and everything I've done and delivering me over to another reality. Those are concepts that are over and over and over in the very, sorry, Kelly. I got excited in the very tradition of it. And so that would be my one guard I would put up. Yes, I think it's a great idea to take it a little bit more to the family setting, but with the intention of, let's talk about these things. Because what we have learned, the three of us, and talking with a multitude of people, is people in general don't know these things. So this is the opportunity to have that be a part of a real meal together.
I definitely agree. And even to go one step further with what you were just talking about within the rich symbolism that shows up within that story, it wasn't just the ancient Israelis or the Jews or the Hebrews or whatever word that you want to use that actually left. There was what they would call the mixed multitude. Now, what exactly that means, I don't think anybody exactly knows, but we have that foreshadowing of the idea of people that are not of that genetic people group, the Gentile nations, representing the Gentile nations, that idea, that have seen the truth, the promise of not only the power of the one true God, the true presence of the one true God, but then is willing to take that leap and believe in the future promises made by that God, whether they think they're going to get any part of it or not, you don't know, but enough that they left their life in order to go and participate within that. They left that where, the Hebrew means the narrow places, and they passed through water in order to get to that new promised land, to become that new citizen. They were born again, this time of, for the believer today, it's of the Spirit, but you see that run up to everything within that shadow and type. So once again, it's just absolute complete, being wrapped up with this nice little tidy bow, for lack of a better way to put it. And then Jesus just laying it out on the table. I think that the disciples would have seen aspects of that. I mean, if we can see it and we're not even in that culture, granted it takes some studying, I can't help but think that there would be a large presence of that happening over and over and over again with what was going on.
There are a couple of themes that kind of struck me this time as I was studying it again was, and I think I mentioned it earlier, the idea that for the first 9 plagues, I don't remember that there is a command on the Israelites to do something to be protected from it. It was simply their nationality, basically, their enslavement, their category. But for the 10th plague, there was this command that you do this ceremony, you paint the blood on the doorposts. Why? God knows, he would know the heart of every man. He would know who there believed in him, wanted to leave, or whatever the standard was. He already knows that. So why is he asking them to do it? It brings a lot of these themes we talk about a lot. There's a relational cooperation. There is the idea that you aren't just being covered because of your nationality. They could have chosen to stay there. That is an option. There's the option to not believe that blood was going to do anything. Well, it's very interesting to me that there's an element of faith in this as well, that it wasn't just, well, you're of this nationality, now you leave. That wasn't kind of how it went either.
Well, and how would that conversation go? I don't think it was necessarily, I don't know, maybe out of fear in which you're painting your doorpost with the blood. It's the idea of that faith. You've already watched these incredible things happen. You've seen 9 of them go down. You've been protected from suffering the consequences of absolutely all of them the entire time. Everybody else is getting jacked up, over in literally the center of the world, Egypt, the most advanced civilization that is on the earth at that time. And quite literally, the Pharaoh is the man god. And all of a sudden, they're like, you need to paint lamb's blood on your doorposts and stuff. The belief comes first, then the action follows. It's not they did the action and then found out it's all true, and now they believe is maybe. I don't know. I can see the elements of how that would be, and the emphasis on the idea of you believe first, then you take that action. The same kind of concepts that we were wrestling with, a few shows ago. How does that show up? Well, you don't have, I even wrote it down here. You don't have that ritualistic aspect of it. Jesus was inaugurating right now through him the idea of this new covenant, and that he is the fulfillment of what all of the prophets had been saying. And he's letting everybody know that at the Last Supper. And so this covenant is not of like stone tablets or the stone heart, so to speak, or the hardened heart, where it's done just from the hand. Now the transformation is complete. It's done with the mind too. And what we were talking about with the seal of the Holy Spirit goes on the forehead of the believer. Whether it's symbolically or there's some sort of actual spiritual seal, I have no idea. But it's not on the hand for the believer. So it's that transfer from that hand to the forehead now, and where we see this concept of the mark of the beast at some point, whether it's in the future or in the past, whatever you believe, it's on the hand and the forehead. So there are people that are true believers in Pharaoh, true believers in Satan, or true believers in the world or whatever, but there are the go along to get along, and that's the hand symbolism of it. And a lot of people take that extremely literally, but you have it written down in Deuteronomy. You also have the shadows and types and the echoes of that going on with this story right here as well. Think about it like from this point of view. You got Judas in the room the entire time, faking being a disciple the entire time. He was casting out demons. He was healing people. He had all rights and all privileges and authority of whatever a citizen of Christ's kingdom looked like showing up here on earth at that time. He was running around doing all these things too. So much so that when Jesus was like, one of you guys is going to betray me, they were all looking around. They couldn't tell who was who. Now, obviously, Jesus knew the entire time. But my point with that is that there's this idea of it's about just the belief now, that transfer, it all moves over into this new way, this new citizenship of this kingdom. Once again, it's not about what you do, but what you do is going to follow through with what you believe. So there's no seal on the hand. The seal is only on the forehead, that kind of concept.
I had a question, but it's not related to what you said, which always makes me feel bad. So should I say like you? Absolutely. And now I'll move on to the point that I wanted to make. That's what absolutely actually means. I was thinking about it because my son and I attended church on Sunday, and they had communion, and it was it was the wafer and the little cup and, antisocial and somewhat the introvert in me loves that. But I thought, okay, so now knowing what I think it should be, I don't necessarily think the answer is to stop doing the way it's done as a congregant. But I think I liked the idea that you had about instituting something more in our own community with people, basically inviting them in, having the meal, making it something different. But I'm wondering how it would appear to a congregation, especially since I barely started attending this one, to be like, well, I'm not going to take it. I've been in communities where someone refuses to take it, and it's such a distraction because people are like, because we've been trained to think that the only reason you don't take it is because you don't think you're saved, or you've got a problem between you and another believer, or you're angry at God. And so now all of a sudden, without being able to clearly communicate it to a larger audience why you're not doing it, are you creating a disruption in not doing it? Because I was just thinking that through as they passed it, because I wasn't listening during the sermon. I was actually writing down notes about communion. So anyway, it was on my head. So I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. Kelly and I kind of butted up against this exact situation. I don't know. What do you want to jump in and kind of throw out what kind of happened and the reason why?
Well, at Good Friday service, I was there alone. And I was sitting there and I just felt like I wasn't supposed to take it. You were at work and I'd gone to like the noon service. And I had our dog at my feet. And I was just sitting there and it was like, nope, sit this one out. And that's when we were really having the discussion of what is communion and what is it supposed to look like. This past Sunday, it was communion again. And we were there with 3 of our nieces. And then it was like, we do life with these 3. We're new to the church, but these 3 girls sitting with us, we are very involved with in a lot of what they do. And so we did take communion with them and stuff, but I don't know if you noticed the weird look we got. You kind of like, we went up to get the bread and the juice, and then you led us outside of the sanctuary into the hallway, and the 5 of us prayed together and took communion. And I don't know if you noticed the looks, like one of the, like, I guess sub pastors or whatever kind of like glanced over and was like, okay.
Well, I had no idea. No, I didn't. I don't know if
They're
it would
like,
have mattered if I
they
did
have you
notice.
guys. They have you guys pegged right now. They're like, oh, it's them. Never
Yeah,
mind.
Right.
Start
They do
approach.
everything weird. They never follow the rules.
Yeah, they don't follow. I just wait until this Sunday. I don't follow the rules again. I think that doing it there with the girls where they're at, and at that moment, I think that doing it all together and doing it all as a family thing and doing it all I think that was a good thing. I don't think that there was a ritualistic aspect to it or anything like that. Like I said, I don't think there's anything wrong with asking the questions, and I don't think there's anything wrong with implementing some different things or changing up a few different ways you want to do stuff. If it's on your heart that you need to stop and it's something whatever, and you're afraid to or you don't want to because this is one of the ways that I don't know, the Holy Spirit is different for everybody. You know what I mean? And everybody's going to have a little bit of a different trial and tribulation they're going to get pushed through. For me, I shouldn't go hang out in bars and necessarily go have beers with every single meal. It doesn't mean another believer can't. It just means for me, that's just how I know I'm not supposed to be doing that. Okay, and that's fine. So maybe for somebody else, they are a little too wrapped up in communion, showing that they're a good Christian, and maybe they need to not do it for a while and sit in that moment of uncomfortability and realize that the comfort that they get in the joy of Christ isn't in the ritual, but it's in Him. And maybe that's something that they need. I don't know. But for us at that moment, I thought that with the girls and everything like that, let's get everything off on a right foot, not have this very deep, very bizarre, and very strange theological uncertainty conversation, with teenagers, basically. So, that's where we're at right now, and I don't think that we're doing anything necessarily, disobedient or anything like that. So, yeah, I think that it's a pray on it. And if God's telling you, I don't feel right about it, then follow God and do what God says. Don't necessarily, worry about it so much or something. I don't know.
I like the idea of maybe getting 3 or 4 different parties together that understand the purpose of what you want to do and accomplish and kind of create something a little bit different. And even maybe not in a weird way, but having each person have something that they are going to prepare. And not like it's weird and emotional and like, I don't know, fake sacred. And I don't mean that, but just like we would do, sit around and talk about the real things of the scriptures and what did they mean in their own time, and what is the hope and the representation of this meal? What did he wish to give us, to tell us to do this in the same remembrance way that the Israelites were commanded to? This was the big thing for the Israelites. And so communion, I think, as everything kind of equals out and is fulfilled by him, I think it does have quite a bit of value, and it's not given that. So I would, as an experiment, I don't know if any of our listeners would think that was a good idea or something, just create that with a group of 3 or 4 friends and say, let's spend a little time, look and see, just for the sake of understanding the last event really of Christ's life in his community, to go through the scriptures that they read and to think about what would it have meant to him to see himself in those promises and to be bolstered by that in order to face this incredible work that he was going to face.
I think it's a good idea, and I'd be interested in hearing about it from anybody who decides to try it out. So if that's you and this is something that you've been doing and you have decided to try to share your life a little bit more with other believers, or if you're trying out this idea of maybe keep doing communion at church, but you're also going to do a once a month kind of thing at your house, why don't you write into us and let us know what's working for you, what's not, how awkward the first one is, or maybe how awesome it went, And you can get a hold of us at naughtyversusnice@gmail.com. That's naughty, VERSUS nice @gmail.com. And you can also...
No,
what's
not
that?
yet. I was like, we'll talk to you later.
Right?
I'm ready to end it.
Exactly. So thank you very much, and we'll talk to you next time.